Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be doing the Monsterathon tag. For those who don't know, the Monsterathon is a month-long readathon that goes on throughout September, and this is the tag that goes along with it. This year there is a theme to go along with it. It is Where Monsters Hide, so each one of these questions is based on a potential hiding place for a monster. If you're interested in my Monsterathon TBR for the month, you can definitely check that out, but this video is going to be just recommendations. Now, I've mentioned before that I'm not really big on scary books. I really don't read that many thrillers or horror novels or anything like that, so a lot of my suggestions won't necessarily be themed around the readathon, but they'll still fit their perspective prompts. So first we have Whispering Woods, an underhyped book. And for this question, I have two different answers. I've got a fiction and a nonfiction. For the fiction book, I have The Deep and Dark Blue by Nikki Smith. This is a middle grade graphic novel. It's fantasy and it centers around this set of twins who end up needing to escape because they are connected to the area's nobility and something starts happening and they have to run away to a monastery for nuns and they have to pretend to be girls. But along the way, one of the twins really comes to terms with the fact that they are actually a girl. So you get this neat fantasy story alongside this trans narrative that's done super well. One of the things that I really loved about this trans rep is that it didn't rely on tragedy or on pain. This was very much a story of where she figured out where she fit. There was a little bit of worry with coming out, but there was no huge trauma or anything like that that was related to the transition. But overall, this is just a really sweet book. It goes a little bit fast, but that's kind of to be suspected since it's a standalone and it's middle grade. But I'm surprised that I don't hear more people talk about it just because the rep is really good and it's super cute. This was a early 2020 release. And the other book that I have to answer this question is nonfiction, and it's a book that I have talked about recently, but that is Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins. I love this book. I think that everyone who's interested in social justice related stuff should read this because this adds a really important perspective. This basically looks throughout history at the ignored canon of Black women and how in refocusing where we get our knowledge from, that is, if we actually pay attention to them, we can learn a lot more about the way that Black people have been treated, and it can really enhance our perspective of feminism and of everything. I've talked about this a fair amount in a few other videos, but I really do think that this is an important read. For as many anti-racist reading lists as I've seen, and even like feminist reading lists, I hardly ever see this book suggested. The next prompt is LAIR of the Babadook, a book with LGBT representation. And for this, I have Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Faid Menon. I have sung Alok's praises so many times. People definitely need to be reading them. This is their most recent release, and it goes in and talks about a number of different myths around trans people and non-binary people, but towards the beginning they also share a fair amount of their own story. I really connected with it and I adored this book. The other piece that they have out is Femme in Public, which is their poetry collection, which I would also highly recommend. If you don't know anything about Alok or haven't heard about them before, definitely check out their Instagram. They also do a lot of really wonderful things in terms of art with fashion, and they do a lot of discussion about racism and colonialism, beauty standards, and that sort of thing. The next prompt is Hydras Hangout, a book based on mythological creatures. This one was a little bit harder for me to really pick just because I feel like I don't read a ton of fantasy, and when I do read fantasy, it's like there are magical elements, or it ends up being in the territory of sci-fi. I don't really read a whole lot that has like myths involved, really. But I did find a good pick for this that I've actually read within the past few months, and that is The Guild of Stories by Joel Gomez. This is a vampire book, but it's not really one that follows a lot of the conventions that I'm used to seeing. I said that I don't read that much that involves creatures and stuff like that, but as a teenager I did read a fair amount of vampire novels, just not many that I would probably go out of my way to recommend now. But the Guild of Stories is really interesting. It spans, I think, 200 years. You start out in 1850 and the book ends in 2050. The main character, Gilda, is a girl who is escaping from slavery, and she's saved by these people who end up being vampires. So you kind of go through, get their story a little bit, you learn more about her, and the whole story is situated in the United States, so there's definitely a lot going on about race. There's also a whole lot about relationships. This is definitely a queer novel, and especially towards the end there are a lot of themes about the environment as well. The next prompt that we have is MAH SWAMP, a book with a good looking cover. And for this I chose The Grief Keeper by Alexandra Viasante. I read this book sometime last year, but I plan on rereading it in September. This cover is just really gorgeous. This focuses on Marisol, who ends up having to immigrate to the United States with her sister in order to escape violence in her country. And in order to stay in the country, she has to participate in a medical trial. But as you can kind of tell by the cover, there is a sapphic romance in this. There's also some conversations about race and xenophobia that I think are done really well. This is another book that I feel like is really underhyped. I have barely heard anybody talk about it, which is one of the reasons I want to reread it, because I'd like to give it a proper review on Instagram and have a renewed interest in it so I could talk about it more on here. Next we have Under the Bed, a book by a Black or Indigenous person of color that you have been sleeping on. When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir by Patrice Concolors and Asha Bandele. For those who don't know, Patrice Concolors is one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter organization. In this memoir, she discusses growing up in California amongst stop and frisk laws. She talks about how these heavily impacted the men in her life and also her. She talks about how she got into activism and kind of the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement. This is probably my favorite nonfiction book that I've read this year. The writing itself is incredible. And additionally, her story is just so incredibly important. Unfortunately, it's also just really evident how little things have changed, especially since like the start of her story. I'm not going to go too into it just because this isn't a wrap-up video, but this is an incredibly important read. The next prompt is Secret Crypt, a book with a mystery element. And this one was a little bit difficult for me just because I don't read a ton of straight up mysteries. But the book that I picked has kind of a mystical element that has some mystery about it, so I think that it fits. And that is Are You Listening by Tillie Walden. I adore Tillie Walden. On a Sunbeam is definitely one of my favorites, and this one did not disappoint either. This is a very character-driven book. That focuses in on this car trip that these two neighbors take. They end up finding a stray cat along their way that they try to return to its home. Like I said, it's very character driven, so a big part of the story is kind of learning about their backstories and different things like that. Both of the main characters are sapphic, even though this is definitely not a love story. But I really, really love this. It's only going to be for certain people because of how character heavy it is, but if you like character heavy things like I do, you'll definitely like this. The next prompt is Your Friendly Neighbor's House, a book recommended to you by a friend. For this prompt, I have a few books because I have lovely coworkers who recommend me gay graphic novels. First, I have Kase-san and Morning Glories, which I have talked about at length. I actually have a whole review video for the first few of them up. This is a super fluffy Yuri series that just focuses in on this couple, Kase and Yamada, and you get to see them get together and be a couple. It's super sweet and wholesome. Another book that was actually recommended to me by that same coworker is Road Queen, Eternal Road Trip to Love. And this is another one that's kind of just fluff for fluff's sake. Although, while Kase-san is super cutesy and romantic, they kind of fall for each other, this one is kind of enemies to lovers. There's also fake dating, so if you are into those types of tropes, and you're also into badass lesbians who motorcycle race, absolutely read this one. And then the final gay graphic novel that I wanted to shout out that a coworker had recommended to me is Witch Boy by Molly Alsertag. Now this is middle grade. If you want to hear more about it, I do have a full review. It is a little bit more subtle with the queer themes. While these are clearly like romantic, like fluffy stuff, this one does have a more concrete plot. It definitely has a trans allegory in this that I absolutely adore. And you also see some queer representation in the background. The main character's best friend has two dads, and there's also some sapphic things that go on towards the end of the trilogy that are kind of suggested, but I mean, they're kids, so it's kind of a crush, but I'd still see that as representation. I really adored this, and I just absolutely love that my coworker pointed this out to me. Next, we have A Moment of Peace, a comfort read. And for that, we are sticking with gay graphic novels because that is what brings me peace and joy. So for that, of course, we have the classic Heartstopper. And this book absolutely deserves all of the hype that it gets. I ended up reading the first book, and then immediately afterwards needing the rest of it. So I found the rest of it online and read all of it as much as I could find in a one night. And then I went ahead and ordered the other volumes, which is why I have volume 3 here. The feelings that this series gave me was the same as reading fanfiction of my OTP. So somehow Alice Oseman was able to build that kind of rapport and that kind of relationship in a really short span of time. I've got to say, with the first volume, the first the first half or so, I was a little bit worried. I was like, okay, is this overhyped because I'm not super into it? But when it hit, it hit. And I cannot wait for volumes 4 and 5 to come out. Next, we have Area 51, a book with aliens or mutants. And for this, I have The Seep by Shanna Porter. And I have talked about how much I love this book. This book completely blew my mind. Like, you know, when you read a book and it's like you don't even really understand what real life is anymore because this book has just like melted your mind. That's kind of how I felt after I read The Seep. This is another one that's super character driven, so if you are more of a plot person, maybe this wouldn't necessarily be for you. There's definitely a plot in here, but a lot of what drives the themes and kind of the point of the book is definitely the character and the character's journey. But towards the beginning of this book, the Seep kind of takes over Earth. The Seep is alien technology that can change so many different things. It can cure people of ailments. It can keep people alive indefinitely. It also makes people high. But throughout the course of the book, the main character has to deal with a decision that her partner makes that involves the Seep. And the main character goes through this grieving process. And that's a big piece of what the book is. Another part of the plot also has to do with the Seep itself. There's just so much going on in here and so many really cool themes. I absolutely recommend it. I know that it's not necessarily for everyone because, like I said, it is very character driven, but I was obsessed with this book. Next, we have Rearview Mirror, published 5 or more years ago, or an indie book. And for this, I have a book that was put out by an independent publisher, and it was published in 2013. Which was more than 5 years ago, which is really strange. But that is Nevada by Imogen Binney. This is another very character-driven book, so if you are not a character-driven person, you won't like this. Honestly, this gives me really big Catcher in the Rye vibes, and Catcher in the Rye is something that's really polarizing, so I feel like there are also some people who are really not going to vibe with this, but the people who vibe with this are going to vibe really hard with it. This focuses in on Maria, who is basically contending with the fact that she doesn't really understand herself or know what she wants, and she's forced to contend with this when her girlfriend breaks up with her. So this is kind of a coming-of-age story for an adult. It does involve a road trip, which makes it super appropriate for the rearview mirror part of the prompt. This definitely talks at length about trans issues. She talks in detail about her dysphoria, and there's also a lot of conversations towards the end of the book about some of the problematic medical frameworks that have been developed. I loved this book. I actually plan on rereading it along with Catcher in the Rye at some point, probably in November or December, but don't hold me to that. And so far as the publisher goes, this is published by Topside Press, which actually prioritizes trans and queer books. The next prompt is Upside Down, a retelling. And this one was really hard for me to do because I really don't think I read that many retellings. I read one earlier this year that I kind of wasn't that hyped about. So I've chosen one that I read several years ago. I do want to say, it's been a while. It's probably been 2013 since I've read this book. So I kind of want to reread it just because I don't know what the contents of the book are like. But the retelling that I thought of was Wicked by Gregory Maguire. This is a Wizard of Oz retelling that focuses on the Wicked Witch. And I will say, if you like the musical, go in assuming that this book is completely just not even connected to the musical. They are not at all the same thing. They are both really interesting. I adore the Wicked musical. I also remember really liking this when I read it, but they are extremely different. This book is a lot darker. I can't really tell you much about the other differences because it's been so long since I've read it. But go in having no expectations. And the final prompt in the Monsterathon tag is The Bunker, a book with disability or deaf representation. And for that, I have the poetry collection Tonguebreaker by Leah Lakshmi Pepnitsa Samrasinghe. In this poetry collection, she talks about her experiences as disabled and queer. There is so much really interesting stuff that goes on in here. Now, the first part of the book definitely focuses in on her poetry, but the second part has a few different visual art pieces. So a lot of them are spoken word, but there is also a visual aspect that goes into it, and maybe other sounds going on at the same time, things happening in the background, and that was super interesting to read. So that is all for the Monsterathon tag. Definitely let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you're participating in the Monsterathon. Thank you all so much for watching. Bye.